And our guest scholar today is Dr. Ben Wynne, professor of history at the University of North Georgia. And so, Ben, it's great to have you with us today. So, cheers.
Yeah, I'm glad to be with you, Mike. Good to see you.
Right. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is based on Ben's book, and I highly recommend it. It's called In Tune, Charlie Patton, Jimmie Rodgers, and the Roots of American Music. Tell me a little bit more about these two men that you use sort of as the spine to hold your story together. What can you tell us about these people?
Well, they both were in the first wave kind of recording artists back in the 20s, of course, two different genres. And the reason I chose these two particular guys, Charlie Patton made a name for himself in the Mississippi Delta, and a lot of people refer to him as the father of Delta blues. And much of popular music springs from that blues music. Then Jimmie Rodgers, on the other hand, people refer to him as the father of country music, and he made his first recordings in the late 20s. And both those guys were from Mississippi, and they were born, within 100 miles of each other, give or take. And I've kind of always been fascinated. It's kind of a cliche now, but how music bridges the sort of the racial gap to an extent. Blues music, supposedly, stereotypically black music, comes out of the black community, certainly, and then country music is supposedly, comes out of white music, for the lack of a better phrase.
Right.
But it's neither one of those things are completely true. And the music overlaps. And I've always been fascinated with the fact that you've got Mississippi, which of the segregated states of the former Confederacy, I mean, you can make a good case it's the worst one. And you had two races segregated, by law, but you can't really keep the music segregated. The music overlaps between the artists, and I thought I wanted to, pick an artist, one country guy and one blues guy, to kind of personify that phenomenon. And these guys were just too irresistible to choose because they had so much in common. We're from the same state. And Jimmie Rodgers, he was some people refer to him as a white blues man. A lot of his music was blues based, and blues has a big effect on country. Country has a little bit of effect on the blues. Certainly the blues gives more to country than vice versa. But, Rodgers was influenced by blues music, and those two guys seem to fit.
Being a New Orleanian, one of the things that I was aware of reading your book is that some parallels could be drawn relative to the development of the jazz idiom here in New Orleans. The first jazz, the person who's kind of credited with bringing about the birth of jazz was a trumpeter by the name of Buddy Bolden, who never recorded a thing. The first jazz recording, and he was African-American, but the first jazz recording was by Nick LaRocca, who was of Sicilian descent. And when Louis Prima, also of Sicilian descent, made his ascension in jazz, he credited a lot of his material to Louis Armstrong, African-American, who was 10 years his junior. So this kind of collaboration back and forth between the black and the white community is not only true of the roots of American music in Mississippi, but also in Louisiana. And the other thing that I was fascinated by in your book, again, being a New Orleanian, was the collaboration between country star Jimmie Rodgers, white, and African-American jazz star Louis Armstrong. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that collaboration between Jimmie Rodgers and Louis Armstrong is a very famous collaboration, obviously. And as I'm trying to remember the story, there was a guy named, let's see, Ralph Peer. Ralph Peer had a hand in, he's the guy that's credited with discovering Jimmy Rogers, and he had a hand in recording jazz and blues artists as well. And I believe he's the one that got them together. But that the song that they collaborated on, one interesting thing about it, in the late 1960s, Johnny Cash had his television show, a very popular television show, and he would have different musicians on the show. And he had Louis Armstrong on the show once, and they recreated that scene with Johnny Cash playing the Jimmy Rogers part and Louis Armstrong playing the trumpet, as he had done back in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, whenever that recording took place. So yeah, these so-called race records, which were aimed at the African-American community, and the so-called hillbilly records that were aimed at the rural whites. A lot of times these record companies, the big ones and the small ones, I mean, a lot of the same guys were recording the race records, or they're producing the race records and producing the so-called hillbilly records. So it was not uncommon for all those people to know each other, especially two famous people. But Jimmy Rogers had become pretty famous by then, and Louis Armstrong was well known.
Let's jump back to the start of blues, which in reading your book seems to go all the way back to the days of slavery. And one of the things you mentioned that was kind of a revelation to me was how the slaves would use music to modify the tempo of the work that they needed to do, and to change their work day, and to influence the overseers. Could you explain what you were getting to there?
Well, the so-called work songs that come out of the cotton fields, that was more. There was more to that than just, you know, a group of people undergoing strenuous labor and trying to pass the time by singing. I mean, there was some of that to it, but the slaves, you know, they were in lockdown all the time, 24/7. I mean, it was a horrendous existence, and they really had no way to sort of express themselves openly and talk about things that were important to them openly. They were always scared that the overseer or the master or whoever was going to, you know, hear them and not like what they were talking about or be offended or whatever. So in the fields, the slaves would use those songs. They could slow the cadence down of the work song to slow the actual pace of the work. If they wanted to slow the pace of the work, they could communicate with one another over long distances. The white overseers and any whites that were observing all of this, they did not listen to the words that were being sung. Plus, because of the different dialects that the slaves, you know, different accents and the dialects involved with all the different types of individuals in the fields, you know, they didn't understand the words. All they heard was that rhythm and that cadence. And as long as the slaves were singing, the whites viewed that as, you know, the slaves being happy or being content or being docile or not, you know, not planning to do anything sinister. And so it could lead the overseer to treat them with more leniency, or to not pay quite as much attention to what was going on. Because you got to remember every aspect of these slaves' lives. I mean, they were under the microscope all the time. They weren't able to live their own lives at all. So some of those songs, you had a lot of social comment in some of those songs they were singing in the fields. And the white overseer might not have known that at all, but the slaves did know it. And they could communicate with one another through those songs. And it was more than just the exercise of passing the time of day.
And one of the interesting points that you just alluded to is that by basically calming down or relaxing the overseers themselves, it kind of pacified the overseers. And they were feeling then correspondingly less threat living in a society that really, they were in the minority. The overseers and the whites, in so many respects, were in the minority. So when the African-American slaves were singing, it pacified them and they felt less threatened. And therefore they weren't as harsh. I mean, you alluded to that. And I think was that intentional on the part of the slaves, do you think? I don't know. What do you think?
I would say yes. I would say they knew, I would say they were aware of that, yes. Or a lot of them were anyway.
Well, one of the things you also mentioned is how the words that would be used in these songs would have different meanings in context to what the white overseers or the white plantation owners would hear. And you mentioned that particularly, I think, in relationship to religion, when the spirituals would be talking about the River Jordan, the people singing it were actually visualizing the Ohio and escaping into freedom. Was this a common thing that was also in early music?
Most people that study this type of thing believe that's the case. The religious services, most of the slaves in the South were either Baptist or Methodist, most of them, because those were the two predominant denominations. And the services took place, it was different depending on where you were and how big your building was. In some places, the African-American slaves and the free whites worshiped in the same building, but the populations within the building were segregated from one another. In some places, you would have the white service in the morning at 11 o'clock, and you'd have the African-American service in the afternoon, and you'd have the same preacher would preach both services. Sometimes there would be a white service in the morning and the service for the slaves in the afternoon, and sometimes there would be a slave preacher that delivered the message. But if that were the case, it would have to have some whites present to make sure that the slave preacher was not inciting some kind of riot or something, or some kind of something nefarious, And these churches, they would have a committee for that, a committee for slave instruction, just like they, you and I grew up Baptist, Mike, they had a committee for everything, a committee for the hymn books, a committee to cut the grass, a committee to keep the church painted.
No, we were Methodists, we just called the bishop and asked him what to do.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, anyway, I grew up Baptist, and we had a committee for everything, and they had a committee for that too. And yeah, when they were singing, the slaves were big on the Old Testament, because the star of the Old Testament's Moses.
Right.
And what did Moses do? Well, he delivered his people from bondage. So they perk up when they hear about Moses. They're very familiar with the story of Moses, and they take that to heart. And when they're singing about freedom, or about when they're saying about freedom in the afterlife, I mean, and this is a generalization, but the white crowd, they're talking about deliverance to heaven, to an afterlife. And the slaves may take it more literal to that one day they'll be delivered to earthly freedom, like you mentioned, the Ohio River.
Was there any idea in their minds that Moses was represented by figures like Harriet Tubman or other abolitionists? Was that what they had in their mind, or not? Was that a metaphor for the abolitionist?
We know Harriet Tubman, they called her Moses. She had the nickname Moses because of what she did as far as coming down into the South and rescuing slaves. I would say most of I would say it's more abstract than that. They were looking for a Moses, not any Moses in particular. They were just looking for the day when somebody would rise up and they could live out their own version of that Moses tale. But because I don't think they would have known who these individuals were.
Well, let me jump over to the white side of the equation in pre-Civil War times. A lot of the people that settled in the American South were of Irish, Scotch Irish, Northern English heritage. Did they bring their music with them, and did that impact how we hear country music?
Yes, they certainly did. They brought the rhythms and the music from the British Isles, and they brought them over here. And after a generation or two, the melodies would maybe stay the same in a lot of cases, but they'd have Americanized words, different characters. A lot of the ballads, they tell a story that's got a beginning and an ending, and once that music was transplanted over here into the United States, the melody a lot of times would remain the same, but different words would be put to it.
So moving ahead now, we have the Civil War, we have slavery abolished, and the South moves into a system that impacts both blues and country, which is sharecropping. So tell us about sharecropping.
Well, you say slavery was abolished. That all depends on how a person defines slavery, because you can make an argument that in the Mississippi Delta, where Charlie Patton was from, they had slavery up to World War II. Segregation is a different form of slavery. You're denying people rights based on their race. But 13th Amendment said you couldn't have slavery, but they put the condition, the powers that be put most of the conditions of slavery back into place. And that sharecropping was one way they did it. Now, there were black and white sharecroppers, but with the African-American sharecroppers, that system was used in many places as a means of social control in a way that it wasn't used with the white population. And basically it involved, you've got a white landowner and he lives in a county that's, in the Mississippi Delta, you may have a county that's 20% white population, 80% African-American population. Okay, and most of those African-Americans are going to be sharecroppers. And basically, the white landowners, they own a lot of land, but the land won't produce unless you got workers. They like the idea of having workers that you don't have to pay, so you get these sharecroppers on your place, and you lend them, they have to borrow money on the front end of the growing cycle to get the crop in and to have money to buy the food and the necessities of life that they need to get by. And then the sharecroppers are supposed to pay the landowner back at the end of the growing cycle once the crop comes in and is sold. Well, the sharecropper borrows the money and there's an interest rate involved, you can monkey around with the interest rate, and you can by hook or by crook create a situation where a lot of the sharecroppers fall into the situation where they're in perpetual debt. Just like with a credit card. You don't pay the credit card off, at the end of the month, and you carry that balance on. Pretty soon you're working for the credit card company. Okay. Well, you finagle it where the sharecroppers fall into deeper and deeper debt. You can create a situation where after the first, second year, the sharecropper is working on that land and all of his profits are going to the landowner, and he's not getting his share of the profits. And then of course the landowner, he's got buddies in the state legislature, and they pass things called crop lien laws. The crop lien laws that come into play, once the landowner is able to secure this labor on his land and have them indebted to him in a way where they can never get out from under. Of course, the most logical thing for some of these workers to do would be, just pick up and leave and go somewhere else. You know, move from Mississippi to Louisiana, or move from Mississippi to Tennessee, or whatever. But they're not going to be able to do that because the landowners, the people that control the politics, they got buddies in the state legislature, and those buddies pass these laws called crop lien laws. And the crop lien laws make it illegal for a person to leave another person's employ if they owe that person money. It's a completely unconstitutional type of law, but they passed them anyway, state by state. You know, it was a state statute. And so what that meant was if you did pick up and leave, you would, you know, they could arrest you and put you in jail. So you're trapped. If you're one of these sharecroppers, you're trapped on the land. Now, that didn't happen in every case, but it happened in a lot of cases. And they were stricter with these crop lien laws, and they were stricter on the sharecroppers in places where you had a higher percentage of African Americans because they're trying to control them. So those counties with the higher African American population, that's when a lot of these laws were really heavily enforced, and they really tried to keep them in a subordinate position.
It wasn't though only African Americans, and it wasn't only in relationship to sharecropping. I remember Tennessee Ernie Ford doing a song called 15 Tons.
16.
Or 16 Tons.
16 tons, yeah.
And what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. You end up owing your soul to the company store. And I remember that song very vividly. And here this is sung by a white country star, but when you listen to it, I can't tell. Is that blues? Is that country? What is it? You know, it's the lines are so fuzzy that you can't distinguish the musical idiom clearly. It's not like it's really blues or it's really country. It really is a melding of the two. And so it extended beyond simply sharecropping. It extended to the mining economy and maybe a number of other economies that I'm not even aware of. Maybe the mill economy, I don't know.
That's a good parallel.
Huh?
That's a good parallel, yeah.
So there was a lot of this going on. And like you said, totally unconstitutional, but there never was a constitutional challenge to all of this?
No, not really, because if you made trouble again, they'd kill you. You know, I mean, it wasn't,
Yeah.
it's pretty cut and dry. You know, if you make some kind of problem,
Kind of, isn't it?
you're gonna die.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember when I was small, I had this neighbor who was from South Central Mississippi that moved in across from us. And he would tell me these stories about the whitecaps and what they would do to keep black citizens in line. And he was telling me about, this young man that had the audacity of kissing a white girl. And, I said to him, well, what did they do to him? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, wow, we killed him.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not that long ago. I mean, Emmett Till was only, 1955?
Yeah.
That's within the lifetime of
Mine. Yeah.
lots and lots of people, yeah. So, that kind of thing. I mean, they didn't have the Voting Rights Act until the Civil Rights Act, until 64 and 65. And, and a lot of still a holdover from all that. Some of these problems we're dealing with today come out of all of that.
Wasn't there a big change that was already taking place post-World War II? Because you had this incredible out-migration of African Americans in particular, but not only African Americans, to places like Chicago. The Illinois Central Railroad played a big role in taking African Americans north. I grew up in Chicago, and we had what was called Chicago blues. But now that I reflect on it, it was really Delta blues that was urbanized. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
Yes, it's Delta blues, and they plugged it into electrical sockets. They had amplification. They had electricity in the joints where they played it in Chicago. and they didn't have electricity in the joints where they played it in Itabena, Mississippi. So yeah, a lot of those
came right from Mississippi up on the Illinois Central Railroad, right to the south side of Chicago.
Sure. And Highway 61 is a famous artery of migration out of Mississippi and going north, and it went on through St. Louis and then up. I'm not sure where the exact terminus is, but that was a storied artery of immigration as well. But yeah, those, Muddy Waters, he was born in the Mississippi Delta, and he ends up in Chicago, and he's kind of the quintessential, electric blues player. But yeah, it's just, they called it, it's when the blues plugged in is how they referred to it.
So how did the blues start? How did it get to be popular in this environment of oppression that we've been talking about?
Well, it starts, nobody can tell you when it started, but it became popular. Blues was popular in the African-American community, of course. And blues was popular with white musicians who heard African-Americans playing blues and then disseminated a version of that music to white crowds as well. Somebody like Jimmy Rogers did that. And it's just, it became popular because it's music that evokes emotion, What are they singing about? Well, they're singing about every range of human emotion, And there are a lot of, and it's the blues, it's not all, downtrodden, depressing type things that they're singing about. A lot of the blues is celebratory. And good music is good music, and it's going to get out there one way or the other. And everybody, the African Americans and the whites, even though you had a segregated situation, everybody still lived, near each other and mixed with each other. And it's not like if you were white, you never saw an African American and vice versa. So, it was just inevitable. And then, of course, when you get recorded music, it's more complicated than this, but at first they had recorded music, they had niche markets, right? They get these country guys, and the record companies would say, okay, these hillbilly guys, we're going to get them to record a bunch of songs, and we'll sell that to the white people in rural areas. And then they said, okay, we got these African-American guys, we'll get them to record a bunch of their music, and the market for that will be in the black community. Okay, so they didn't market, the white records to the African-American crowds and vice versa. But then what happens, of course, in the 1950s, that's when the thing crosses paths commercially, because you get white kids start listening to black music, and you got radio stations that are playing that black music, and that's the 1950s is when that first starts happening. And white teenagers who have money to buy records, they start listening to that music and liking it, and then the music starts getting marketed to white teenagers. That's what Elvis Presley, that's the whole Elvis Presley phenomenon. You got a white guy, poor white trash, as they say, singing African-American music, and it just kind of effortlessly sort of conveying this music. And that's kind of where it really exploded. Because I think before Elvis, the recorded music, I think it was maybe $100 million industry. And then by 1960, it was a $500 million a year industry or something like that. And it wasn't all Elvis Presley records, but he opened that marketplace.
Yeah, you're working on a new book, I think, about the significance of the song Hound Dog in this regard, right?
Yeah, I've started on that. Yeah, it's a fascinating story because Hound Dog, people know it as the Elvis Presley song, but it has a unique history. It was written by two white Jewish guys, one from New York, the other one from Baltimore, Lieber and Stoller. It was written for a 300-pound African-American female blues singer, a woman named Willie Mae Thornton. Big Mama Thornton is what they call, that was her nickname. And once she made that recording, it hit the top of the R&B charts in the 1950s. This is all before Elvis did his version. Right after she did her version, there weren't any R&B artists that wanted to cover that song because her version was so popular. So immediately following that release of that record in 1953, you didn't have any cover versions by African-American artists for a while, but you did have almost immediately about a half a dozen country artists covered it and put some pedal steel guitars on it and put some boogie woogie,
That leads me to another question, and that is relative to the birth of rock and roll. I haven't heard anybody give a definitive argument as to the birthplace of rock and roll.
There's 100 different answers to that question. So, but I mean, you can say it started with these Delta blues guys, and there was also country blues being played in other parts. It wasn't all Mississippi Delta, in other parts of the South. But I mean, if you wanted to just go all the way back, you could say that rock and roll began in the cotton fields, where they were singing those songs in the cotton fields. Now, but then again, commercially, a lot of people say that rock and roll was born in a restaurant kitchen in the Greyhound bus station in Macon, Georgia, where Little Richard worked and washed dishes. He wrote that song, Tutti Frutti, while he was washing dishes in the back of that Greyhound bus station. So some people think it was born there. But I mean, it was around certainly before Elvis Presley. That thing about him being the king of rock and roll is just kind of a marketing, nickname. I mean, he really wasn't. But, you could, some of Jimmy Rogers' stuff could be considered early rock and roll music. There's a song by Charlie Patton called Going to Alabama. He recorded in the late 1920s that some people say is the first rock and roll song. Some people say that a song called Rocket 88 that was recorded by Ike Turner's band in the 1950s was the first rock and roll song. We need to go on and on and on with that, because rock and roll, there's so many, it's a big river with all the different tributaries. So it just depends on how far back you want to go with it.
Blues music, we obviously have songs about plantation life, the sharecropper life, and the life living in this system of poverty. But country music also kind of came out of a system of poverty that sort of locked in poor white Southerners. So their upward mobility was always limited, right?
Right, certainly commonality there. I mean, the blues, what are the themes of blues music? Poverty, tough times, lost love, found love, sex, redemption, escape. Well, all those are blues music themes, and they're all country music themes as well. That's why you got so many blues songs and country songs are about trains, because everybody's trying to escape.
What was this about trains and mobility and going to the next place that made that so popular?
Well, because I mean, if you're talking about, in the South, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but, most of the people were very poor. And especially if you're talking about the African-American community, you're living under these really oppressive conditions. So, that's why escape is a theme of some of that music. You want to escape whatever condition it is you are in because you don't like it. And you got to remember the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, if you were an African American and you were going to get on a train and go to New York, if you were going from the Mississippi Delta to New York, I mean, that's almost like me and you go on the moon. That train, it would pull in the station, and then it's going to pull out of the station again. And these people that are in Itta Bena, Mississippi, or Bruce or Holly Bluff, Mississippi, or Bentonia, or, you know, all those places. That train comes in and you're looking at that train and you're wishing, boy, I would wish I was on that train. Because when that train pulls out, where does it go? Well, it goes over the horizon and it can go anywhere. The train can take you anywhere. And so it was seen as this, you know, it's more than just a train pulling in the station and pulling out.
Yeah, and these people were just locked. These people were just locked in place. And I really appreciate in your book how you talk about ministers were admired and blues and country singers were admired because they weren't locked into place the way everybody else was.
Right. It's just like you said about mobility. You look at somebody that was mobile and that could move around. That was somebody to be looked up to, you know, because that person was doing stuff that other people couldn't do. I mean, you're talking about leaving the state by the time you're 15, only a couple of times. Imagine if you never left your county, you know, back in the 20s or 30s, if your universe was the county that you lived in. I mean, think what a tiny universe that is. And think about, again, the train, you know, it is the pathway, you know, it's the vehicle that can take you to the outside world. So it wasn't so much, I need to get on that train and go to this specific place. It was, boy, I could get on that train and then use your imagination. You could go where, you know, where you go anywhere, you know, no telling where you could go. So that's why they all love those trains. And then of course, you know, those train whistles. They like the country. They like the country music. They like the train whistles, the lonesome train whistles. Mm-hmm. There's all common themes. I mean, the blues music and the country music, I mean, they're singing about the human experience that knows no race. You know, it's people love, they hate, they hurt, they celebrate, you know. So the themes are all similar.